Welcome to Literature Out Loud, sponsored by RUNE, the Robert Morris University Literary Journal, and RMU Radio. I'm John Lawson. My guest is Ed Ochester, nationally renowned poet and editor of the Pit Poetry series. It's a privilege to welcome you to Robert Morris University, Ed.
Thank you.
We're joined in the studio by Pittsburgh poet and wonderful creative writing teacher here at RMU, Tess, and by RMU student and creative writer Jamie Truax. Thanks for joining us, Tess and Jamie.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having me.
Ed Ochester's identification with Pittsburgh is long and deep, but surprisingly, he's actually an import, having grown up in Brooklyn, New York. His academic credentials are stellar: a BA from Cornell, an MA from Harvard, and an MFA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In addition to editing the University of Pittsburgh Press's poetry series since 1979, he founded the journal 5 a.m. Ed was twice elected president of AWP, the Association of Writers and Writing Programs. He's published some of the biggest names in contemporary American poetry, including Sharon Olds, Billy Collins, Gary Soto, Toy Darracott, not to mention our special friends here at RMU, Jan Beatty and Jim Daniels. And the list goes on. Ed Ochester has published many collections of his own poetry over the years, going back to 1967's We Like It Here, and including the Devons Award-winning Dancing on the Edge of Knives, A Drift of Swine, maybe my favorite of your titles, The Land of Cocaine, Republic of Lies, and Unreconstructed, poems selected anew. He's currently Professor Emeritus at the University of Pittsburgh and is on the faculty of the prestigious Bennington College MFA writing seminars. His newest poetry collection, published by Autumn House, is called Sugar Run Road. I've just bought it and I can't wait to read it. I hope you're going to read some selections from it as part of our show today, Ed.
Oh, absolutely. I thought I'd start with a poem that's partly about hockey, since we're unfortunately in Pittsburgh, possibly at the end of the hockey season coming on. The subject matter of this goes back a couple of years. It's a poem called Even As I Write This. Thousands of my fellow Pittsburghers are whooping and singing and drinking, falling into gutters because the Penguins won the Stanley Cup. Salk discovered polio vaccine in Pittsburgh. Our people, driven and underpaid by the evil Carnegie and Frick, made the steel that transformed the Republic. Warhol left the city to become the maggot in the brain of the haute bourgeoisie. And tonight I spoke to a friend who said with great excitement, "We're the only city ever to win a Stanley Cup in the same year as a Super Bowl." Well, smile, friend. But if you smile in contempt, you don't understand the deep grammar and inner mystery of your native land, which is at least as strange as ancient Rome, which held mock naval battles in the Colosseum, read the guts of animals to foretell the future, and whose citizens marched in solemn procession to placate the whimsical triform goddess who governs heaven and hell and earth.
That was my guest, Ed Ochester, reading his poem, Even As I Write This. Ed, take us back to the beginning. I don't think it ever occurs to most people, hey, maybe I'm a poet. So there you were growing up in Brooklyn. How did that thought come into your head?
Well, a couple of things. One was, and again, this is an old story for lots of people, but a teacher in high school who is a really good person who grew up during the Depression, and she probably would be a university professor if she hadn't been a high school teacher, because high school teachers were where the jobs were at that time. But she was great. She knew everything. She had read a lot, and she cultivated an interest in poetry in me and some other guys in a high school in the city of New York, which was a pretty tough high school. It was a hard job for her to do that. And things just grew after that. I've been writing ever since I've been in my mid-teens.
Ed, you're so revered by so many poets and writers in Pittsburgh and nationally. and for good reason. You've produced a consistently excellent body of work, and you continue to produce. How does that work? How does writing poetry fit into your daily life? Do you write every day, for example?
No, I don't write every day, but I should say that I think it's very good for younger writers to write every day, because it takes a long time to discover when you're writing. You know, a friend of mine who has published widely writes every day for a couple of hours. But the trouble is that if you write poems every day for a couple of hours, you're going to turn out a lot of junk, and it seems to me. And one learns how to listen to oneself and see when there's a poem that's coming along, or something interesting you think that's coming along.
Have you?
And so I do that. But I would say also that I have loved the teaching that I've done, and that really has fed my own interest in writing, has been suggestive in many ways for things that I've written. I love editing, and it's a way to keep in touch with what other people are doing around the country and elsewhere. And all of those things feed into it, so that I always feel as though there's something coming in, and very often what is coming in is very useful in my own poems.
Have you ever had a writing block? Have you ever experienced writing block?
Not really, except what I would say is that many of the poems in the new book were written in about a year and a half. I would say about 80% of them, and that's pretty quick for me. Before that, there was a period of about 2 or 3 years when I produced a few poems, but nothing very much. And I'm old enough now to know that that's, for me at least, that's how it goes, and I don't get terribly nervous if I'm not producing right away. Starting with this book, I've been writing a great deal, and I'm still doing that right now, a couple of months after the book has come out. So I just listen and wait and see what happens.
Wonderful.
How about another poem? Can we hear another poem now?
Sure.
Great.
Let me read the poem, poetry from the new book. I think that's a good one in a way when talking about the practice of it. There's a reference at the end of this poem to Galway Kinnell, who died a short time ago, who's a wonderful American poet. And the quote from Galway at the end of this poem is one of the best suggestions, or suggestions, let's say, for a writer that I've ever heard. That's at the last 2 lines of this poem. Poetry. I too dislike it. The mystified truisms, the dusty puzzle prunes, the theatrical exaggerations, the brutal crescendo of woodworms. And yet, I think of O'Hara's delight in the endless pleasures of quotidian life, and Duhamel throwing a dozen balls in the air and juggling them all. Frank O'Hara said only a few poems are as good as the movies, but that was a long time ago, before a lot of bad movies, before background music, before there was almost no silence, and the private life is an insult to others. Poetry is the most private art. Lee Young remembering his father, combing his mother's hair, Sterne and Gilbert with their mouths open, walking down a street in Paris, Judith writing the mysteries of level green in her father's radioactive chambers, Catullus registering his private ecstasies and fears while the machine of the state ground on, Kinnell saying, "Go so deep into yourself, you speak for everyone."
Well, I'll never forget hearing Galway Kinnell at my undergrad institution when I was like a sophomore. He came and read that unforgettable poem, The Bear, where he's tracking the wounded bear and living off its frozen turds, in the snow. Quite a powerful poet. If you've just tuned in, this is Literature Out Loud, and that was my guest, Ed Ochester, reading his poem, Poetry.
Ed, you were briefly mentioning about some fond memories as an editor and as a teacher, and that has probably led you to have read tens of thousands of poems by other people. Which poets have personally influenced you over the years, and what are some poems that you're reading now, and does that ever factor into your own writing, what you're reading? Does it influence you in any way?
Sure. I think the two poets who've influenced me most, maybe I'll say three, but the three who've influenced me most are Edward Field, who's a New York poet who's now up in his 90s, who was a wonderfully adventurous and fearless writer. He's never been terribly well known. He's never had a reputation as large as, say, John Ashbery's in poetry. But on the other hand, he was a part of a large movement of New York school poets back when Ashbery was starting to write. I ran into his work by accident when I was in graduate school, and it really turned my life around. The other person who I also met when I was, or whose work I was reading when I was in graduate school, was James Wright, who has influenced a great many people, a great many writers in the United States, who also is responsible for, I think, a great change in American poetry from the middle of the 60s of the last century down to the present. The great change that Wright made was essentially emphasizing the conversational and the colloquial voice, as opposed to using a poetic diction or emphasizing conventional poetic forms. And Wright, who was from Ohio, did it so well, that you can hear, you read his later poems and his middle poems, and you can hear the sounds of people who are speaking in towns in eastern Ohio right now in those poems. It's just absolutely beautiful. And I would say the third person who's influenced me a lot is the poet Jerry Stern, who also is in his 90s, who's been a friend for many years, and also in his own way has done a great many things to experiment with the human voice on the page, the poet's voice on the page. So all three of those have meant a great deal to me. I still read everything that Stern produces, and he produces a book every 3 years, thereabouts, I'm sure to read. I also particularly like one of the poets we have in the poetry series, Denise Duhamel, who I mentioned in the poem I read earlier, and David Lehman, a New York poet and editor who I've known for a number of years. I think is just extremely witty, really smart. Many of his poems are the wittiest things I think that are produced in American literature right now. But I read in general. I think that one of the things that is very lucky in my own life is that I have the ability to publish the poets I like most. And so there may be, in all of the years that I've edited the poetry series, there may be a couple of people I've not truly loved. I just thought they were quite good at what they did. But most of the people I enjoy reading and recommending to others, and I come back and read the book after they've been in print. So in a way, that's a happy thing. I can reward people I think are doing great work, and I've done that now for more than 25 years.
I'll never forget Stern appearing at the last jazz poetry thing. There'd been a series of readers and jazz performances that were okay, but when he came on and started reading, it was like this apotheosis. Suddenly, oh yeah, that's poetry, just incredible. Well,
he also is a wonderful reader. He spritzes a little bit, so you don't want to sit in the front row if he's reading. But it's easy to tell, even now when he's up there in years, His personality is absolutely splendid. He is always joking. He's always putting people at ease. He's really cross, and he conveys those things when he starts a reading. You know, people who've never heard of him or have never heard him read will all of a sudden be captivated by the guy when he stands up.
It was interesting to hear what you said about James Wright and the idea of his voice echoing the voices of the area where he grew up. I think our listeners can probably hear your distinct voice and style. And I'm wondering, looking back at your career, how you think that voice has evolved, or thinking on your quote from Galway Canal, is going deep to speak for everyone, bringing you closer to your own voice?
Well, I read that many years ago. It's in an essay of his that goes back at least 20 or 25 years. But in a way, when I read that for the first time, it authorized me to use and not to disregard an impulse in me that's very deep, which is to use conversational voices. And I think the only way that my poetry has changed or evolved in recent years is that I've been working toward a more conversational poem than I've ever done before. And I've been trying, without being pretentious, to touch on subjects that are very important to me and presumably to other people. The midsection of the new book has those poems which I think are somewhat more conversational, more narrative, more anecdotal than other poems that I've written in the past. But they seem to work. You know, I like them. Readers apparently like them. They've been taken by magazines. They go pretty well at readings that I do. So I'm pleased with that direction.
Wonderful.
Well, could we hear another poem?
You bet. Let me read you one from my previous book. This is also going back to my own past, to a movie star in the old days and an aunt of mine, Aunt Carrie, from the old days, Fred Astaire. The secret of his popularity was that he looked like a bus driver who could dance. In my teens, I hated his movies and told my Aunt Carrie they were corny and unrealistic. But she just laughed and said, "You go to his movies because they ain't realistic." Aunt Carrie, who worked as a file clerk and spent an hour each way on the subway commuting. And later, if I'd been honest, I would have realized that's why I loved Dickens and Keats, his Grecian urn. And doesn't Fred look a little bit like Carlos Williams, who also talks plain without ornament, just like Astaire when he's singing? A critic said he had an unspectacular voice and lacked the vocal technique of a trained singer, but had great respect for the lyrics and immaculate timing, so that even Mel Torme called him, as a jazz singer, the greatest, bar none. And how wonderful that the man who danced with Ginger Rogers and Rita Hayworth and Judy Garland and worked with the Gershwins, Ira and George and Noel Coward, was really named Frederick Austerlitz, the son of an immigrant. And that when he took his first screen test, some moron, probably an early critic of Williams too, reported to his boss, "Can't act, can't sing, balding, can dance a little." No wonder Carrie loved him as she shuttled underground in New York. I mean, nearly everyone, if they worked their asses off 40 plus a week, got enough to live on, and like most Americans, lived on dreams.
That was my guest, Ed Ochester, reading his poem, Fred Astaire. I certainly hear that conversational tone there, Ed, and it suggests a sensibility that is capable of getting down to brass tacks. And look at our friend Jamie here. He's an undergrad English major, worried about what he's going to do when he grows up, like most of us were. Why should students like Jamie care about poetry? What does poetry have to offer them?
Well, the answer to that is a very old one, I think, and that I'm simply repeating from others. But anything that has to do with the spirit, the soul, if you want to call it that, or the pleasures of the emotions, has to do with poetry, and poetry has to do with those things. I have known, as an individual and as a teacher, many people who in their 40s or 50s, after good business careers, will say something like, I've always wanted to write, I've always wanted to paint, I've always wanted to play the guitar, and they never did it. And to me, that's the saddest thing that you can possibly do. I am very much aware, and I love money, I'm very much aware that one needs to get on in the world. As a person, when I was graduating from my undergraduate college, I got accepted to Harvard Law School and to Harvard graduate program in English. And my father, who was a person who worked through the Depression and who was an incredibly hardworking human being, said, if you go to law school, I'll pay the way. If you go to graduate school, you pay for yourself. And so, partly because of the old antagonism between sons and fathers, but partly because that's really what I really wanted to do, I went to graduate school in English, and I've never regretted that. And it also has been true, I've been lucky, but I've never had any real difficulties getting by. I know that a lot of my students, who I tell don't think about going into teaching unless you're absolutely driven to do it because the market is so bad now, but who make other choices, will do things like working and writing related jobs, which allow them to write also. They will write for a major bank like Mellon Bank, Pittsburgh National. They'll work in advertising agencies. They'll work in various other places that need the written word. And if that's agreeable to them, that's fine. Other people I know are perfectly happy doing what they do as young writers while they're doing their standard jobs, working as a waiter or a waitress, working as a bartender. Some people I know, including some of the best students I've had in recent years, don't want to do anything else. They're perfectly happy not to be in the business world because they think it isn't the life for them, and they, doing other jobs, can make enough money to get by, not enough money to be rich or well off, but it suits them, and so they do. But the answer to it is the same reason to say, why do you play tennis, or why do you want to make love? Because it's a lot more fun than working in some crappy job.
Yep, it sure is. It's been a great pleasure spending this time with you at Ochester, and I want to thank you for visiting with Tess and Jamie and me today. Would you usher us out with a final poem?
Yes, and thank you too. It's been a pleasure to be here. I wanted to end with a poem that's at the end of the new book of mine. It's a brief one. It was written for my wife, who is, among other things, a great reader and a feeder of birds. Her name is Britt, and the poem is called For Britt. It was written on December 16th, about 2 years ago, on Beethoven's birthday. Beethoven is such a great composer, but his personality is questionable, which shows once again that one is what one does. Music, poems, or even money have claims, but also such unremarked acts as feeding sparrows in winter, which God doesn't do too well, though we're told he notes the fall of every one. So that as I park the car, your sparrows in the snow-covered forsythia greet the weak sun with a matrix of cheeping, dozens of them, not from gratitude, but perhaps from overflowing joy.
That was my guest, Ed Ochester, reading his poem For Brit from his new collection, Sugar Run Road, published by Autumn House Press. Here's what poet Alicia Ostreicher has to say about Sugar Run Road. Quote, "How often do you read a book of poetry that is first and foremost enjoyable? Ed Ochester opens Sugar Run Road by praising Pittsburgh's deep grammar and inner mystery and ends with his wife feeding sparrows in winter, which God doesn't do too well. In between, he romps through rich anecdotes and meditations on poets and poetry, family, American history, work, war, Bach and Mozart, Hemingway and the Emperor Nero, and much more. Ochester's love of the art of poetry, married to his love of the common material world, gives birth to serious fun and wisdom." Serious fun indeed. Thanks for spending time with us today, Ed. I hope it's been as much serious fun for you as it's been for me.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks too to Tess Berry and Jamie Truax for joining us in the studio today.
Thanks again. And Ed, thank you for making me so glad that I'm not another business major.
Thank you, Jamie.
Yeah. Thank you. It's been wonderful, Ed. Really inspiring to hear you, to read, and to hear you talk about poetry. It's been very inspiring.
Tess, thank you.
You've been listening to Literature Out Loud, sponsored by Roon, the Robert Morris University Literary Journal, and by RMU Radio. Thanks for listening.